Hello and welcome to our live recording of Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Before we start, today I wanted to take a moment to say a special welcome to our live audience. Today's guest, Professor Renée Adams, is a professor of finance at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, an expert on corporate governance, bank governance, and gender. Professor Adams is a fellow of the European Corporate Governance Institute, a former finance department editor at Management Science, and a former chair at AFECT, the American Finance Association's Committee for Women in Finance. Professor Adams, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, especially to the fact that you invited me to talk about such an important topic. It's really appreciated.
Well, I'm really excited. I first came across your work in a thought-provoking piece that you wrote back in 2012 that was debunking 6 common myths about female directors. And I thought it'd be really interesting to get your latest perspective on those and talk about some of the implications for boards. So I thought I'd start with the first myth that you debunked, which was that popular boardroom surveys provide an accurate picture of women's relative underrepresentation. And you argued that because women tend to be better represented on larger firms, but they are less represented on the boards of smaller firms. Have you come across any evidence to suggest the accuracy of that picture has changed?
No, I haven't. And actually, this year I was looking into this question again because the FTSE Women's Review argued, they put out a report where they argued that gender balance is in sight. And I'm always really excited when I hear that gender balance is in sight. So I went to take a look at the numbers that they were basing this claim on. And so basically what they do is they look at the FTSE 350 and they showed that the representation of women on the boards of the FTSE 350 is about 42%, which sounds really great. But then if you consider the fact that in the UK, there's about 1,700 listed firms, looking at the FTSE 350 might raise some questions because you may say, well, what about the other firms? And in fact, if you look at the other firms, so if you look at the entire sample of listed firms in the UK, the representation of women is about roughly 50% of the number for the FTSE 350. So obviously, once you look outside the largest firms, the representation decreases a lot. So the idea that gender balance is in sight is, I think we have to do a bit more work.
Do you have a view on why that's the case?
Well, there's probably several reasons. In one of my papers with Danielle Ferreira, who's at the LSE, we showed that connections play an important role for whether you appoint women to boards. And so it could be that small firms have fewer connections than large firms. But one thing that I've always thought would be interesting to look at, which I haven't done systematically yet, is a lot of the policies around gender diversity on boards, they focus on the large firms and they measure what's going on at the large firms. So if you focus on the large firms, then of course the large firms will respond by appointing women. But then the question is, where do they get these women? And it's entirely possible that they get the women from the small firms. And so one hypothesis is that maybe policies cause reallocation of women from small to large firms rather than systematically increasing gender representation.
Let's talk about myth 2, which is one of my favorites. The financial crisis would not have happened if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters. Do you still think European Union Commissioner for Competition, Neelie Kroes, who made that claim, was wrong?
It's also one of my favorite myths, I have to say. And yes, but she was wrong in the sense that her assumption was wrong, right? So she argued that the financial crisis wouldn't have happened because if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, based on the assumption that women are more risk averse than men. Okay. And that is where I think she went wrong. In particular, I have some work where I argue that, in fact, if you're a woman in finance, you may actually be less risk averse than a man in finance, right? And so could the financial crisis have happened with more women in finance? Sure. And so what I think the fundamental problem is when people make these claims is that people forget about selection, right? So the women in finance are not going to be typical women because you've overcome barriers to enter finance. As a woman, it's not a very typical job. Actually, by the way, it's not very typical for men either. So both women and men in finance are different from the general population. And so therefore, it's not at all obvious that there's going to be a gender difference in risk aversion that's the same as in the general population if you're talking about the finance industry.
One of the things that intrigues me about that comment is the implication is that something could have been done to avoid the disaster. And it doesn't really allow for the idea that disasters will happen. That's the very nature of risk. Even if you're sort of 90% certain of a positive outcome, 1 in 10, you'll have a disaster. You have spent a long time in the world of governance. Do you think there's any variation in board composition that might have averted the financial crisis, or are crises just periodically inevitable?
That's a pretty big question. Right? So are crises inevitable? Maybe. Does board composition matter? I think it probably should and can. Now, whether changing gender diversity in particular would matter, I really don't know. But I think there are some interesting things. So when you look at bank governance, for example, in the US, one thing that people noted after the crisis is they said, oh, look, there are a lot of people who sit on bank boards who don't seem to be experts in finance. But actually, one reason that there are people who sit on the boards of banks that are not experts is by design. So because of rules regarding competition, so bank competition in particular, you actually can't have someone who is, for example, another banker sitting on your board as a bank, right? So the person who you think might have the most expertise, you actually can't have sitting on your board. And so then you might say, well, actually, that might be a problem. So I really need financial experts sitting on my board if I'm a bank, but I can't have financial experts sitting on the board. So could adding financial experts somehow make a difference? Probably, right? How do you do it so you can get around the fact that you don't want to induce anti-competitive behavior? That's another matter, right? But so I think there are constraints that one has to recognize in governance that actually may make governance inefficient or less effective than it could be. And part of it is regulatory.
Let's go on to myth number 3. So female directors are just like male directors. What advice would you give to a chair listening to this who's considering board composition about how to factor gender into their thinking?
I think gender per se, which is really a biological factor, right? So the question is, what do you mean when you say, I think I'm going to think about gender in the context of board composition, right? So what is it that you're really looking for? And I think if you're saying, well, I need people with different experiences, then you can say, well, how do I find those different experiences? Could be women, could be men, there's many ways of achieving diversity. But then if you're saying, well, look, we don't have any women or we don't have enough women, then that might be a symptom of a problem because maybe your recruiting practices are designed to, or maybe you're always tapping into the same networks, right? Maybe you're not designing your recruiting or board search processes in a way that you're getting the best possible candidate pool. So I guess it's a tricky issue because a lot of times people argue, and we'll talk about the business case, right? But a lot of times people say, oh, well, you need a woman on the board because gender diversity increases firm value. But gender per se is really not value relevant, right? What matters for the board is that you bring knowledge and experiences and expertise to the board that help the firm achieve its objectives. But biology per se, there's not really a reason why biology matters. It's the skill set and the experiences and the different attitudes or whatever that might matter.
So I guess my lived experience of that is if you have a single gender, and typically it's sort of all male when that's the case, something is lost in the quality of the discussion. And I think it also sends a message to the rest of the organization. And so I would expect that to show up in some of the data, that the negative impact of that. But you're saying that's not the case?
No, it can be the case. But this gets back to the point about you could have a bunch of guys who all think the same. You could have a bunch of women who all think the same. Both of those groups would benefit from having diversity, right? Now, but you could also have a bunch of women who think completely differently. So not all women think the same and not all men think the same, right? And so the question is, well, you could have a bunch of guys where you say, well, something is lost, but you could also have a bunch of guys where nothing is lost because they all have completely different experiences. They grew up in different places. They come from different countries. There's many dimensions of diversity, right? So I think but I think this goes back to the point. So if you don't have a woman, so unless you think that there's some weird distribution of talent, which I don't, I think talent is randomly distributed, right? So So if you don't have a woman on your board and you systematically don't have a woman, then I think that's a sign that there's something else going on. So if your boardroom feels like there's something lost, there may be a cultural problem. And so it may be a flag that there's something going on in the boardroom and maybe you need to appoint a woman. But it's like, actually what you need to do is you need to address a cultural problem, and addressing that problem might lead you to get more women. But if you have a cultural problem, putting a woman on the board is not going to solve the cultural problem necessarily.
Let's move on to myth number 4, which was that HR directors are to blame for the gender imbalance on boards. And you challenged the idea put forward by the European Commission, amongst others, that the reluctance to appoint female candidates to board positions is often rooted in gender stereotypes in recruitment and promotion, a male-dominated business culture, and the lack of transparency in board appointment processes. You also challenged the assumption that there's a quick fix to improving the lack of gender diversity on boards. And instead, you argued the problem is that there are just not enough women at the top of the corporate ladder who are potential candidates for director. I imagine you got some strong responses to that position.
Oh yeah, I get strong responses to many of my positions. But the point that I make in my research is that obviously the policymakers have an incentive to say, well, everything's the fault of the companies. So let's just put the burden on the company. Let's have a quota, right? Because then the companies are to blame. Let's put a quota in place and then the companies help to solve the problem. But my argument is that a lot of the fact that women are underrepresented on boards is structural. It's societal, right? It represents what's happening in society. And so for example, what we show in our research is that countries where you have more women working full time have more female directors, and they make up a larger portion of the director pool, right? Which, once you think about it, is completely obvious, right? But that's not how people are talking about the issue. So the way people are talking about the issue is they're saying, oh, well, it's the companies, they have discriminatory hiring practices, and so that's the problem. But it's not so straightforward, right? Because how could discriminations persist if it's just companies discriminating, right? And so obviously some people dislike when I point out that there may be more fundamental problems that drive women's underrepresentation. And obviously the people who dislike it are policymakers, because putting a quota in place doesn't cost a lot of money. So basically you say, well, the companies have to abide by this rule. How much money does that cost? I don't even know, but it seems pretty, easy. But something like childcare, which would enable more women to work full time, that's very costly. And in particular, cost taxpayers a lot of money. So that's not very popular. The argument that, well, actually we need to focus on childcare rather than quotas is not very popular with policymakers. And then, of course, other people think that if you're against quotas, it means you're against women's rights, but that's actually not the case. So I'm not against women's rights. I just think we need better policy making. And I just don't view quotas necessarily as the optimal way to address the underlying problems.
Don't get me started on childcare, because that's close to my heart, and I just cannot understand why policymakers do not make that a tax-deductible cost, because I think that would change the pipeline of talent dramatically.
Oh, I completely agree.
What's interesting to me, though, is that it does appear that there has been a material uptick in the gender balance on boards since you first wrote your piece. And if your argument holds that the candidate pool of qualified female directors is smaller, is the implication that the quality of the female directors appointed to boards roles is on average likely to be lower given they've come from a smaller pool of qualified candidates? Or how do you think about that?
Well, I actually think it should be the opposite, right? The smaller the pool of female candidates, the better they should be. And I always think I get a bit uncomfortable when people talk about quality of individuals, which is a common argument that people make. But basically, if you think about it, so the smaller the pool, the harder it is for the woman to be there. And so the more of a sort of like superstar she has to be. And some of my evidence is consistent with this, because basically what we show is the women, so as directors, so as you're underrepresented in the boardroom, the women actually have characteristics that one might consider to be more desirable. So for example, in some of my research, I show that women are more shareholder oriented than men. So if you want to maximize shareholder value, then you should put more women on the board, not fewer women on the board. And so I would say that's a desirable characteristic. And so the women are better than men in that, along that dimension, if you want to frame it as better or worse.
I'm delighted to announce Enter the Boardroom now has its first sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform saving you time and money on your cross-border transactions. As an investor, I was acutely aware of the value of hedging FX exposure. I used to live in fear of funding shortfalls at a closing or making a loss in a business having forecast a profit. However, as a CEO, I'm embarrassed to say I have dropped the ball on FX. Because we invoice our revenue in pound sterling, I stupidly thought we had minimal FX exposure. After speaking with Alt21, I realized a significant proportion of our software costs are in US dollars. So we have wasted money on FX fees and widespread, while also taking on unnecessary risk in our budgeting because we assumed the spot rate would continue through the year. I can't be the only one to have slipped up on this, and it's an area board members can quickly add value with the right questions. Alt21 allows you to lock in fixed fees and secure exchange rate before any cross-border transaction, allowing you to budget with certainty and protect your business from market volatility. At New Roll, we're now forecasting savings of 90% on the fees we incur on the tens of thousands of monthly FX spend thanks to Alt21. Head to alt21.com, that's ALT21.com to find out more. Well, that brings us nicely on to myth number 5, which is adding a woman to your board will improve shareholder value, because actually, notwithstanding what you just said there, I think you debunked that as a concept. When you wrote the article, you argued none of the studies showed positive causal shareholder value effect of having a woman on a board, only correlation. Have you seen anything since that has changed your mind on that?
No. And actually, I have to say that now I've decided that actually this is an impossible question to answer scientifically. So there's basically, I can't see any possible way to causally identify the effect of gender on firm performance. And one reason is really simple. It's because people are bundles of characteristics, right? And so, you can't disentangle gender from other characteristics, both for women and for men. And so in one of the papers that I wrote on this issue, basically what we showed is you can't disentangle gender from an independence effect. So basically, women tend to be non-executive directors. So they're closely aligned with the definition of independence that policymakers care about. And so when you change board composition by adding more women, are you changing gender or are you changing independence? You can't disentangle the two. And so therefore, to try to causally identify the effect of gender, I think it's impossible. But pushing it even further, I also maybe think that we shouldn't care, because the flip side of asking whether more gender diversity adds value is saying, well, so if we don't have women on the board, this goes back to my previous point, maybe we're discriminating. And do we think discrimination adds value? So if you're not, you could say, well, should we add more women because that will increase value? Or you could also say, well, should we stop discriminating because maybe that will add value? And so I think if you don't have women on your board, I think you have to ask whether you have problems. And then you have to try and solve that problem. And then probably you'll have more women on the board. But to argue that just because you're a woman that you add value, or just because you're a man, same argument, that you add value, I think it's impossible to establish that.
The final of your 6 myths, quotas are necessary to improve female board representation. And you argue that since quotas are costly, other mechanisms should be kept in mind, that we've got to go beyond superficial fixes if we're to break those glass ceilings and realize the full potential of our diverse population. How has your thinking evolved on this in the last 10 years?
Let me also just clarify that I think quotas are costly for the women and the companies, but not for the policymakers, right? So going back to that point, yeah, I'm still convinced that we're treating the symptom, not the disease. I'm becoming increasingly concerned about the very large backlash against women's rights recently. And I think a lot of the narrative around diversity and quotas and all these policies is not helping the issue. In fact, I think it's in part to blame. So I really think that we need to be much more careful and much more thoughtful about how we approach these issues, because if you just say, oh, now we're just going to appoint women for reasons that may not be compelling, like a lot of people, when you say, oh, the business case argument, right? So if you appoint a woman to the board, shareholder value will increase. Do people really believe that's true? It seems like, well, how can that possibly work? Tell me how this is going to work, right? You appoint the woman and then shareholder value increases, right? So like people in business who are skeptical of this argument, I think they have the right to be skeptical. And then if you force it on them, then you create resentment and backlash. I think it's natural, right? So yeah, so I really think that we need to take a more educated and careful approach to these issues. And it's much more urgent now than it was because there's so much backlash.
Yeah, that's one of my great worries, actually, that you were seeing this polarization driven by, and you can understand why this is such a charged topic. But when people start going in too hard, I think it then drives people away from one another and just more firmly embeds them in their respective positions. And what I see is a split between the silent resistors who, outwardly are saying, yes, we agree, but inwardly are not convinced and becoming less convinced the more they're having it pushed on them, which I think is deeply problematic.
Yes, I completely agree.
What are the latest myths on boards that need debunking today?
Well, one of my current favorites is the idea now everyone is talking about ESG and stakeholders, right? And so it used to be the case that boards were supposed to maximize shareholder value, and now they're supposed to maximize stakeholder value. And then people argue that, well, one way to do this is to add more women to the board, because we all know that women are more empathetic and caring about stakeholders than other people, which I think is another example of stereotyping, right? So in fact, as I mentioned earlier, what we show is that if you look at women's attitudes towards shareholders and stakeholders, women can be more shareholder oriented than men, but also there's variation across women. So in some countries, women may be more stakeholder oriented. In some countries, they may be more shareholder oriented than men. And so I think in general, we need to be very careful about telling these stories because we're stereotyping, and stereotyping can't be a way of making good decisions. Right. So you need to be really careful about understanding that things are much more complicated and institutional environment matters a lot. I think it's really important that people don't just say, well, now we're going to, because also think about the burden put on the women, because now they have to save the world because there's a climate crisis and they're going to be on the board to fix the climate crisis. So thank you very much.
So you've looked, obviously, at a lot of boards. If you were given the task of building your dream board, how would you go about doing that?
I would probably look in unconventional places. I would look outside my field. I would look outside my industry. Obviously, I would use a platform like yours to try to brief. And that wasn't prearranged. Yeah. And so in the academic context, I've always been an advocate for blind recruiting. So you're not able to see, like you strip the CV of demographic characteristics and things like where you went to school, which I think is really important. And you try to evaluate people on the basis of their accomplishments rather than who they actually are as people. And I think that can be really helpful.
Got it. Before I turn to the questions from the audience, I'm going to quickly go to the lightning round where I'm going to say a quick statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay.
Best book every board member should read and why?
People should go outside their comfort zone. So if you're a man, you should read a book by a woman. And one book that I read recently that I thought was cool was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is basically a take on David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And so it's a woman doing a riff on a book written by a man. So I think that's like a cool thing to do. And one reason why it's good to read, why I'm a strong believer in reading fiction, but I'm also a strong believer that you should read fiction by people who are different from you because it helps you think beyond easy categories.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Lazy thinking.
Most valuable board ritual?
I always think dinner is where the real talk happens.
Favorite quote?
Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you.
Most significant professional insight?
Trust my intuition.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Give up.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
So when I came into academia, I thought structure was really important. And now I think individuals are everything.
3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
We still have a long way to go to achieve gender balance. We're currently treating the symptom and not the disease. And we need much more humility. So we don't know as much about gender differences than we think we know.
So let's go to some more of the questions. Question from Ray. Would it be a step too far for the chair of an all-male board to insist on an only female shortlist for the next hire?
It is an interesting position, but legal issues aside, basically you can do your search in different ways, right? So there's nothing wrong with experimenting in how you do searches. So you can try one thing one time and one thing another time. So sometimes when I organize conferences, I say, well, whenever there's a male presenter, I put a female discussant, right? But I don't advertise this fact. I just do it. So, and you play around with the dynamics and then you see what happens. And so there should be maybe that's going a step too far, but there should be some role for experimentation.
Another question from an anonymous listener. Do you think the first step for a chair should be having a board effectiveness test undertaken? Any thoughts on that? Any research that relates to that even?
I do know that people do board evaluations. I don't know that the literature says that a board effectiveness test is associated with board effectiveness. So I haven't seen any research that says firm performance is higher if the board is qualified as effective, right? Because that would be like too easy, right? If you knew how to make an effective board or how to test that, then we wouldn't be sitting here right now. So is it a good idea to think about your board and what makes it effective? Sure, of course. But would you then say, well, suppose you say, oh, we passed the board effectiveness test, so therefore we don't have any problem. I think that would be taking it a step too far. So you can do the test, but I would take the results with a grain of salt. Let's put it that way.
Really interesting. You've just pulled the rug from an entire board effectiveness review industry there in one foul stroke. What's interesting to me is it regularly comes up. We host these mastermind groups for our community where we bring together those on boards to share challenges that they're facing. And one of the most sort of common recurring solutions to those problems is, have you got a board effectiveness review done? So it's interesting that for you in the academic literature, that there's nothing actually to suggest that's effective, but certainly from those practitioners, it's one of their sort of go-to solutions that has helped them unlock a lot of problems.
Well, let me put it this way. So if a bunch of boards wanted to reveal their board effectiveness scores so that we could actually do the research, I would love to do that, right? But so the reason that we don't know anything about whether these things are effective is because nobody makes them public, as far as I know, right? So are you as a board, suppose you said we're not so effective, are you going to disclose that to the world? Probably not, right? So it's a very hard thing to study. And then if it's very hard to study, then you have to say, well, it could work, it could not work. So
there's still hope for that industry.
There's still hope. And I'd love to partner with anyone who wants to give me their data.
Okay, well, we'll put a call out for that. Next question comes from, again, another anonymous listener. How do you define lazy thinking, which you talked about as your pet hate on boards?
That's a fair question. So what is lazy thinking? I guess in some sense, it's not thinking. Right? So I think in the diversity space, especially, people don't think. They just assume, they just go with the easiest answer possible, and they don't spend much time thinking things through. So I think you're not doing lazy thinking if you actually sit down and say, well, does this actually make sense? What are the problems? One thing that really bugs me is that people don't ask what the problem is. They just say, oh, we're just going to do this because, I don't know, everyone is doing it, whatever. But it's not, oh, let's try and solve an underlying problem, right? So why are women not on boards? That's actually a really interesting question. But people don't frame the discussion around that. People just say, oh, women are not represented. Let's just put women on boards. That's not a solution to the problem. That's just saying, well, we're going to put women on boards, but we're not actually going to address the reason they were not there in the first place. So to me, that's a bit lazy.
Final question from an anonymous listener. What advice would you give a relatively newish independent director starting their second non-executive role?
There's a whole policy discussion about multiple board seats. Regulators hate multiple board seats. So in some countries, they actually put restrictions on how many board seats you can hold. And there's a fair number of academic papers that argue that having multiple board seats can be detrimental. And the argument is that you become less effective. Now, I actually disagree with the sort of blanket statement, because I think the more board roles you hold, the more connections you build and the more experience you gain, right? And so you can definitely cross-pollinate. And one thing in a piece of research I did is I showed that you often find that people who have multiple board seats sit on the nominating committee. And to me, that makes perfect sense, right? Because a lot of people, you've sat on multiple boards, you're very well connected. And so who is the best person to sit on the committee that's responsible for finding new directors is a person with lots of connections, right? And so I think that suggests that you can add value. I think boards it's not just the individual, right? The board also understands the capacities of the individual directors, right? So if they're saying, oh, we're going to put you on the nominating committee, but we're not going to put you on the audit committee, they fully understand that, well, you might be stretched, but we can still you still bring something to the board. Yeah. But I would say, generally speaking, the attitude in the literature is that it's a negative.
Renée, time has flown, which means it's time to bring this to an end. But thank you so much for taking the time to share your huge experience and learning. I love making those connections between the world of research and the practical elements of sitting on boards. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout Ned. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.